6:33, I'd like to call the January 4th, 2016 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting to order. Can we get the roll, please?
Mr. Robinson?
Present.
Mr. Spring?
Here.
Mr. Strike?
Here.
Mr. Walker?
Here.
Mr. Cange?
Present.
Mr. Spinelli? Here. Ms. Bailey?
Here.
Ms. Dean and Mr. Sporhays have been excused. Thank you.
Thank you. We have minutes before us. I have a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
It is moved by Mr. Cange. Can I get a second? Any objection or comments on the minutes? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. Disclosures. Mr. Spring.
I have none.
Ms. Bailey.
I have none.
Mr. Strike.
Yes, through the chair. Because of I was absent during the last presentation on case 2015-0119, so I would recuse myself from these deliberations as I was not present.
Very good. You're in for a short evening. Thank you for coming. Mr. Walker.
No disclosures.
Mr. Cange.
No.
Mr. Spinelli.
None.
And I have none. There is nothing on the consent agenda. The one item that we have in front of us is 2015-0119, an ordinance amending the Anchorage Municipal Code, Title 21, to enable marijuana establishments, and amending Anchorage Municipal Code, Old Code, to enable retail marijuana stores in the downtown Central Business District. The public hearing has been closed. It was held on December the 14th, so there's no opportunity for public hearing. I think at this point we'd like to hear from staff, who's prepared some suggested amendments based on our conversation. I'd also just like to remind the commission, as well as those in the audience, that our action here is to make a recommendation to the Anchorage Assembly. The Anchorage Assembly would then introduce and hold a public hearing on the proposed ordinance and take it up. I believe their plan is to take it up sometime in January or February, but in the near future. So our action here is one of a recommendation to the Assembly, and as such, there's no appeal that is appropriate here to this body. So if we could, Ms. McConnell, have an update to the staff packet and walk us through some of the amendments that you proposed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. At your last meeting, you did commissioner by commissioner walk through issues or that you would like to see potential amendments about. There were 15 of them, and they are included in attachment 1. Staff then proposed an additional 4 amendments, and I want to touch on amendment 17. This is relating to the separation distances. Since the December 14th meeting, it's come to light that the state regulations did not enact the federal drug-free zone standards, which I've quoted on page 1 of the memo as being within 1,000 feet of the real property comprising a public or private elementary, vocational, or secondary school, or a public or private college, junior college, or university, a playground, or a housing facility owned by a public housing authority, or within 100 feet of a public or private youth center, public swimming pool, or video arcade facility. So what we've done with the maps that we've provided to you and that are displayed here in the building is we've created 2 sets of draft maps. Draft 2 shows the separation distances that are just as consistent with state regulation as we could make it. And then draft 3 shows separation distances that incorporate both state regulation and the federal drug-free zones. I already know that, there are some errors. For instance, nobody thought, the planning department doesn't maintain a list of video arcades or the number of machines that might be in each one. So we missed Chuck E. Cheese. So that's something we would need to add. So I know that the maps are not 100% perfect, but they are intended to, give the general idea of where these separation distances would occur. So that's what I wanted to highlight. I've also included the Cole memo in the packet. Turns out there's actually at least 3 different Cole memos, but this is kind of the basic Cole memo. There's one relating to medical marijuana, there's one relating to financial crimes in marijuana, but this is kind of the general guidance regarding marijuana enforcement. With that, I'm happy to take questions.
Mr. Kange.
Thank you, through the chair. Ms. McConnell, just a couple things. When we talk about, in your memo, great deal of risk with the applicant, what type of risk are we looking at?
So, through the chair, Mr. Kange, keeping in mind that I have not spoken to any federal agents, it would seem to me that the federal government, especially given their emphasis in the Cole memo on preventing the distribution of marijuana to minors, that the federal government would be more interested in enforcing against marijuana businesses within their federal drug-free zones. Again, that seems to me a risk, but that has not been confirmed to me by any sort of employee of the federal government.
Sure, thank you. One more, if I may. What happens if an arcade goes in somewhere where there's already a pre-existing marijuana use type facility? What would happen? Are they grandfathered in, or do they have to go away at that point because it's under federal law, right?
From the state and the municipal perspective, they would be grandfathered in. I don't know how the feds would treat that situation.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Spinelli.
Yeah, regarding the Cole memo, is dated August 29th, 2013, and I was just curious, you then mentioned there was a couple other ones. Is this the most up-to-date one, or was there any research done to see if the maybe opinions had changed, or there's any more up-to-date information?
The other two memos that I'm aware of, I believe one was earlier than this and one was later, they all have the list of 8 bullet points that you see going from the first page to the second page as emphasizing that this is where these are the enforcement priorities of the federal government. But again, they kind of had different subject matters. This was the most general of the 3. One was, again, relating to medical marijuana, and so far the state of Alaska doesn't distinguish between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. And the other one was about financial, it was about banking and marijuana. So I can get those for you if you like.
Well,
right now.
it's not necessary that I think we see the other memos. I just thought that the marijuana industry might be relatively new, and a 2-year-old memo maybe be out of date. So, but I have no idea. So,
I'm pretty confident that the Department of Justice has not issued any additional guidance.
okay, thanks.
Mr. Spring.
Through the chair, that's thanks for giving us the information about the federal drug-free zone. It seems to me, though, that the intent of the federal legislation wouldn't allow for marijuana establishments to be in place even after it was met the 1,000-foot separation if, for instance, a school went in place within that boundary. I'm pretty sure that federal legislation wouldn't tolerate that because it's called a drug-free zone, obviously. And although we could do that in our local ordinance, I think, with our separation, I don't see how you can do that with the federal regulations. But it seems like it would be is that something that legal department could look at, or?
Certainly I can carry that back to them and ask them.
Yeah, it seems very unlikely that they would allow a lawyer, for instance, would know better than me, but would allow that kind of exception. I mean, the intent would be violated as a result, whether it was the prohibited use went in before or after. It wouldn't matter, but I think that's a real problem, potentially, with it. And also, on the maps, do you think, it looks like the maps were 2 sets. One was just federal distances and one was federal and state. Do you think it makes much difference regarding the availability of land if we took out or included some of the other uses that the municipal assembly included in that list of separation distances, for instance, dedicated parks? I don't believe that's on the map.
Through the chair, Mr. Spring, so Draft 3 includes both the state and the federal separation distances, just to clarify. I
Yeah.
didn't bring the, sorry, I didn't bring the drafts from December 14th, so we can't compare.
So it would definitely be more restrictive if you included those other
Yes,
uses like dedicated parks, for instance. And
yes.
It would be kind of interesting to look at, but I understand the problem.
So just to clarify then, Ms. McConnell, the draft 3, both draft 2 and draft 3 reflect the commission's proposed amendment to delete the separation distances from those uses that are not in the state requirements?
Or the feds.
Or
Correct.
the feds.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Walker?
That was an accident, sorry.
Question, is there any way, I mean, we can sort of quantify visually, it's very difficult to get a sense when you just look at these bubble maps at this scale. I mean, do you have any sort of quantitative data that says when you go from draft 2 to draft 3, there's an X percentage or X acres or X parcels that are no longer in play than otherwise would have been? Or is there any way to sort of tell what the impact of the map is other than sort of visually guessing?
I'm sorry, I don't have any quantitative data.
I think that's, I think we've been asked to, make recommendations here tonight, and I don't think, we talked last time on how the maps kind of came in late and they weren't really that available for either our review or for the general public to really peruse. And I think I've seen some maps passed around from private entities that have frankly dug into this a little bit better. And I think I'm going to go on record at some point during our findings to say we're lacking some good GIS analysis here. And in part, we can't really say what we're making available or not available through our decisions here tonight. I think that's a shortcut. I know the staffing issues, but it's a little bit challenging. Is there any other questions for staff? Any other questions on the maps? What I would propose, and Ms. McConnell, if you're okay with this, just having us work through our amendments and explaining what those are, and then at the end we can ask for a motion to adopt the resolution either with or without these amendments and with or without additional amendments, however the commission wants to go. But if you're amenable to that, if you could start walking us through amendment number 1, I guess.
Sure, and I did compile the amendments that were proposed in the staff report and the laid on the table sheet from last meeting, so they're all in this one document. So as staff had recommended in its original staff report, I'm going to combine 1, 2, and 3 together, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair.
That's fine.
This was the discussion of whether marijuana retail sales should be allowed in the RO district, which is the residential office district. The inclusion of a retail sales establishment in the RO was a bit of a mistake. The RO has never allowed standalone retail stores. It's been a buffer zone. It's often used as a buffer zone between residential areas and other types of commercial areas or heavy trafficked roads. And so it's often had a lot of office uses, medical uses, hotels, that sort of thing. And so retail businesses are only allowed when they're within those types of buildings. So Mr. Spring was interested in at least considering saying that you could have marijuana retail stores as long as they met the same restrictions of having to be within another type of allowed use, such as an office building or a health service or a residential building within the RO district. Given the general concerns about odor, staff would prefer to eliminate marijuana retail stores from the RO district altogether, both in the Anchorage Bowl, which is amendment number 1, and in the Chugach Eagle River area, which is amendment number 2. But amendment 1A is the alternative that Mr. Spring brought up for discussion.
And I think as these amendments get pushed forward, we can ask for whether you support them or not. I think what I'd like to do now is just ask for clarification rather than to debate them. Is that okay? So at a later time, you could speak to that. John, is that good? Okay. So that's 1, 2, and 3. Any other questions on 1, 2, or 3 for staff? No. So 4.
All right, it's 1, 1A, and 2.
Okay, gotcha.
So number 3 is, as was pointed out before the last meeting, that there is a section on uses in which uses where children are not allowed, and that section really relates to adult businesses. And so it talks about the 1,000-foot separation distance from a pretty broad list of uses, but it is intended just to apply to adult establishments like strip clubs or adult bookstores, that sort of thing. And so I think it was Mr. Spring's sharp eye caught that we would need to exempt marijuana sales and liquor sales. Liquor's already in there, but add marijuana to that list to say, you know, this section is not applying to marijuana establishments, even though minors are not allowed in marijuana establishments. Moving on to number 4.
Yep.
This was trying to, so the land use approval of one of these businesses expires under certain conditions, and one of the conditions is if the operation of the business becomes substantially different from that which was reviewed and approved by the decision-making body, which again is, in this case, is the assembly. This is similar to language for special land use permits for alcohol, but there's a specific discussion in the alcohol section about what might make a different, a substantially different business, such as having, you know, dancing or some sort of entertainment. Well, those things didn't really apply to marijuana establishments. So we tried to put in a little bit of language that tries to clarify a little bit about what substantially different means. I'm not 100% satisfied with this, but it's a beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Amendment 5. This is related to the downtown Chugach Eagle River Overlay District. The downtown Chugach Eagle River Overlay District has portions that are have an underlying zoning of B3 or CEB3, and portions that have an underlying zoning of CERO. And so this was to clarify that the marijuana establishments that are allowed in the downtown overlay are allowed in the B3 portion, not the RO portion. Amendment number 6. This is something that was responding to some public testimony that right now an applicant has to hold a community meeting before they can apply, make an application for a license and land use approval. And generally, they're certainly encouraged and generally use the community council as their community meeting, the community council meeting. But if for some reason they either can't use the community council meeting or for some reason choose not to, the community council should be notified of the happening of the community meeting. So this would require that.
What does your note refer to in the staff comments?
So the title of any ordinance has to describe everything that's happening in the ordinance, and this particular section is just in the common procedures of Chapter 3, which isn't otherwise amended by the marijuana ordinance. So I would have to change the title moving forward to the assembly, that we've added another amendment section into the ordinance. It's not a big deal, but it'll change a little bit what it looks like, and if you, the commissioners happen to see it later, I just wanted to let you know that it would make the title a little bit longer.
Okay, thank you.
Amendment number 7 was to discuss allowing marijuana cultivation in large lot residential districts. I don't think it was entirely clear, but I assume that the intent was to allow the limited cultivation of no more than 500 square feet in residential zones. If that's not the case, then this amendment would need to be adjusted. But the proposal was to allow them in the R6, the R7, the R8, the R9, and the R10. One of the commissioners requested a discussion of water and wastewater issues in relation to this amendment. So it wasn't exactly a question, so I wasn't exactly sure what information was desired, but I tried to do a little bit of research about how much water consumption is used for marijuana cultivation, and I kind of got a variety of information or a spectrum of information, and I didn't find any useful information on what sort of wastewater would result. But I do note that in general, these large lot districts are on private wells and septic systems for the most part. In Amendment 8, this was to allow retail stores in the I-1 district. Amendment 9, this was to allow retail stores in the I-2 district if they were co-located with a cultivation or manufacturing facility. And the way this is proposed and written is that they would need to be in the same building, that you couldn't have a large parcel of land with a store at one end and a warehouse for the cultivation or the manufacturing at the other end.
And otherwise, you are supportive of both of those amendments, staff is?
Yes.
They're neutral?
Well, neutral, yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Brandon, did you have?
I was just hoping to get a quick explanation why two separate buildings were viewed as a problem.
In general, we don't want to encourage standalone retail businesses in the I-2 district. We've had this industrial land use study. We've had a lot of information about how we need our industrial lands to support our economic base for a lot of industrial type of sorry, I've lost my word. A lot of industrial uses, and we've cut all other sorts of retail businesses out of the I-2 district. And so to allow this type of retail business kind of opens the door to general retail moving back into I-2.
Thanks.
Thank you. Number 10.
Amendment number 10 is what was requested from the commission to look at the separation distances as just being what is required by state regulation. So this amendment would match draft 2 of the maps. I feel like I may not have given you exactly the correct information before. I think I said parks could come off, but as it turns out, athletic fields and playgrounds are still part of the state definition of recreation or youth center. So we kind of drew little lines around the parks and around the athletic fields and the playgrounds within parks and measured the separation distance from those playgrounds and fields. So not every park is then off the map, but again, we've just drawn lines around those uses in parks. I did find the definition of correctional facility at the state level, which does include a halfway house. So CCRCs remain on the list.
A question from Mr. Kange.
Thank you. Maybe this is just clarification. In your comments, your definition is correctional facility, but in the language we use the term correctional institutions. Is that just semantics, or?
Yes.
Is there, okay. So no definitive.
No.
Got it. Thank you.
Amendment number 11.
But just so you have reflected that on the drafts 2 and 3. You haven't included dedicated parks, but you've included the playgrounds.
And the athletic fields, correct. Just those 2 bits of some parks.
Okay. Number 11.
Mr. Spring was interested in a approval standard for the assembly to evaluate the concentration of marijuana facilities. Right now, for alcohol licenses, we do provide the assembly with the information of how many other types of licenses are within a 1,000-foot radius, and we had proposed to do the same thing with marijuana just as information, but this amendment will have the discussion of using that as an approval, as one of the approval criteria that the Assembly will evaluate when they're evaluating the license and the land use approval.
I'll let Mr. Spring speak to that at a later time, but thank you. 12.
Number 12, this was a additional application information submittal requirement for cultivation facilities. Number 13, this was to allow the production of edibles to take place in B3 districts. And this would include, there was a lot of discussion about, renting a commercial kitchen for one day a week or something like that. If a commercial kitchen is used to create marijuana edibles, it would need a marijuana manufacturing license. And if it had that license, and if this amendment were to become part of the code, it would be allowed in the B3. They would just have to get their land use and license, land use approval and license.
Question from Ms. Bailey. Go ahead.
Just a clarification question. If the concern is that it would, to make sure that this area is not available or open to the public, could this be another area in which there could be co-location if there's a wall separation like we're considering with the industrial use?
Should this amendment go forward, you could co-locate the edible manufacturing and the retail store, and then the retail store would be open to the public.
Thank you.
Amendment number 14 was to allow cultivation facilities in the B3 district. Amendment number 15 was...
And Ms. McConnell, are you going to, as they come forward, is your desire to provide staff's rationale at that time during our deliberations, or do you want to verbalize why staff does not support this amendment at this time?
I wasn't planning to verbalize it because I wrote stuff, but if you'd like me to, I'd be happy to.
I think just it'd be helpful for the record here to just hear why
Right.
you don't agree with that proposal.
Well, staff is concerned both with manufacturing and cultivation facilities that these are, because the public will not go into them, they can't have windows, that they are going to be industrial type uses. And there's been a lot of work to discuss how to improve some of our, our town center areas, our midtown area, to encourage more pedestrian activity, more, adding businesses downtown to improve the vibrancy of the area. And when you have large windowless warehouse buildings, you're not adding to the pedestrian character of the district, the vibrancy of the area, and these are just large warehouse buildings, and staff doesn't, the comprehensive plans don't encourage that type of building or use in our commercial areas. Although there are some.
And all we have is really a couple of blunt zoning districts that cover the entire municipality for the most part. So B3 is B3 in all places, even though it has an industrial feel in certain areas and maybe more of a central midtown sense in other areas. Is that right?
Sure.
Okay. Number 15.
This was an attempt to flesh out what a neighborhood responsibility plan would look like.
Before we go in, Ms. Bailey, comment on either 14 or 15.
Yeah, I had a question on number 14. If the main concern is to encourage a business or that vibrancy and walkability, would the staff concern be lessened if it was amended so that it was cultivation facilities are allowed if they are co-located with co-located with and attached to a retail establishment? kind of the same thing that is proposed in the industrial area, that we're allowing retail to happen there, but this being the reverse, you're allowing cultivation to happen if it's co-located.
It seems likely that that would help in at least some situations, yes.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Spinelli.
Kind of following up on that, I know we have some buildings, some are brand new, located in B3 that are completely vacant or very much so vacant. If somebody wanted to, say, take the 8th floor and locate some kind of marijuana facility on there to kind of help out their bottom line on their business, and it wasn't maybe the ground level, it didn't change the feel of the neighborhood, I mean, is that something staff would object to? I guess I'm just always looking for flexibility.
Sure. I guess my only thought about that is we have many, many, many more one-story buildings than we have 8-story buildings.
Mr. Spring.
Yeah, regarding amendment number 15, I like the plan, or the elements of the plan. It seems to me that there's something missing, though, regarding how do you follow through on the plan? I mean, how do you know what meetings have taken place and how they maybe have handled disputes? It doesn't require any log or any documentation of it. It just says, tell us how you're going to handle these problems. Is that something you think is would be useful in this? Or I'm thinking similar, it's hard to make analogies, but for instance, the gravel pits have nuisance, oftentimes complaints regarding dust or noise, and they're required, I think, in all the cases I've looked at, to file a report, a log of reports of complaints and how they responded to it. If this is similar to that, if these are potential nuisances, perhaps they need to have something like that as documentation, rather than just a plan they present to you. Yes, you've met that requirement, but there's no follow-up or requirement to tell us how you follow through with it.
Through the chair, Mr. Spring, that's certainly one option. Another option is that if the neighborhood isn't satisfied with the business operating in compliance with its neighborhood responsibility plan, it could discuss this with the assembly at the yearly renewal of the license.
Thank you.
Mr. Kange.
Thank you through the chair, Ms. McConnell. Do we make any other legal businesses submit a similar type plan?
There's nothing in code that requires it. As Mr. Constant reminded the commission at the last meeting, there was a requirement placed by the commission on the Brother Francis Shelter to enter into an MOU with the Fairview Community Council, and I did bring copies of that if you would like to see that.
And I believe that was brought on after many, many years of complaints and other
I think
violations.
that is true. Yeah.
And I'm just going to stay for the record. I didn't agree with this last time, this neighborhood responsibility plan. I think it, although albeit it sure has good intent, I just think we would be burdened with the oversight of this plan. And if we don't make any other legal businesses, anyway, like I mentioned that last week, and my thoughts haven't changed on that matter, and I just wanted to put that out there for the record.
Thank you. Mr. Spring, are you still in the queue?
No, I'm not.
I think that represents the 14 amendments that kind of we put forward. Then, and have you spoken to the amendments that staff's putting forward?
I was wondering if you wanted me to go through 16.
Did I miss one?
16 through 19.
I'm missing it on my.
Well, these are additional amendments proposed by staff.
Oh yeah, please do.
Okay. 16. This was actually brought up during the discussion at the last meeting, but wasn't on anybody's list, and so I didn't know whether that was an omission, conscious or unconscious omission, so I provided it in case somebody did want to pick that up. But removing the marijuana retail sales establishments from the B1A and B1B zoning districts. Again, these are small neighborhood business districts, sometimes, very much within neighborhoods. For instance, the Fire Island Bakery is a B1A district.
Before you go on, I have Mr. Spring in the queue.
I'd just like to thank you for picking that up, because it should have been in the list originally. I appreciate it.
I should note, however, we did ask this question to the Assembly, and the Assembly chose not to, or said they were happy with allowing marijuana retail stores in the B1A and B1B. So, Amendment 17 is the separation distances that include the federal drug-free zones. This amendment is reflected on draft 3 of the maps. Generally, again, as I mentioned, we've missed at least one video arcade and possibly 2 that I know of. Amendment 18 is a proposal for your consideration to change how the separation distance is measured. It has some pros and some cons. I mean, the pros are that it's a lot clearer. It's a lot clearer to demonstrate on a map. It's a lot clearer to implement. The cons are that it does make the separation distances a little bit larger, and that it can kind of punish establishments that are on a large lot, because you start you start from the edge.
And again, the reason is it's easier to administer?
It's easier to administer. It's clearer for everybody involved, clearer for the business owner, clearer for the public, clearer to express on a map. It's just a proposal. And then Amendment 19, in some discussion in the last couple weeks, it was clear that there were a lot of different thoughts about what the term business hours meant, and whose business hours we were talking about. So the amendment proposes to use language that's adopted in state regulations and in the working draft of the licensing ordinance to say that establishments have to be open for inspection and examination at any reasonable time and in a reasonable manner.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. McConnell, for running those through. Are there any other questions for Erica? I don't see any other questions. What's the will of the body?
Mr. Chair, I do believe you have a motion on the floor.
We do have a motion that was postponed. And did it?
Ms. Blake, I think that's the case. Look in the minute.
No, it would have been from last meeting. So, you're suggesting then that the motion that was postponed was a motion to simply adopt as written? You need a couple minutes?
Commissioner Walker moved to recommend to the Assembly the amendments to Title 21 with the recommendations from staff. So the recommendations from staff would be amendments 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's on page 6 of the minutes.
And your view is that the postponement doesn't supersede, that main motion stays before us?
That's my view.
No, it's just on the floor. Mr. Walker.
As I said last meeting, my intent was to open the dialogue and get us talking about the issue. So if I need to remove my motion, I can certainly do that or withdraw it. Or also, I think, John was basically making an amendment to my motion to add a lot of these amendments. So wouldn't there actually be 2 motions on the floor? Or
No, the issue is whether or not we need to just amend the motion that's on the floor. And I just, for point of clarification, the amendments that were proposed as part of your your motion, were these ones laid on the table? That's your view, Ms. McConnell, the 1, 2, and 3?
There were 2 in the staff report and 3 laid on the table, and those are reflected in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the chart handed out.
So they're in there.
Yes.
If we
Yes,
just
you
want to go off of that, we can, okay.
Can ignore the ones from last time.
To be clean, if Mr. Walker, if you want to withdraw your motion, and then I'd accept a new motion that really gets us on the page of the staff's page here, I would appreciate that.
So I'll withdraw my previous motion.
Thank you. Now, the case is in front of us. Anyone wishing to make a main motion? Mr. Spring.
If I could have a preamble to that, I think my motion will be to recommend approval of the municipal ordinance as presented with a series of amendments. And I would like to go through each amendment, 1 through 15 or whatever, 18, individually, and have a vote on each one. Would that satisfy?
That'd be great. So you would like to bring those forward as individual amendments to that motion?
So I move to recommend adoption of the ordinance. Let's see, what are they calling it? We have a name for the ordinance?
You have a name. It
An
is.
Ordinance, recommend approval of the ordinance amending Title 21 to establish marijuana uses.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. Is there a second? Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Anyone wishing, Mr. Spring, you want to speak, or do you want to introduce an amendment?
Yes, I would like to introduce the series of amendments. And amendment number 1, delete the T for marijuana retail sales establishment in the RO district. And I could combine that with delete the T for marijuana retail sales establishment in the CERO district. That's amendment number 2. Those are related, as staff pointed out.
So the motion to amend the main motion is with amendments number 1 and 2. Is there a second to that motion? Mr. Spring, there you go. Seconded by Mr. Kange. Is there any discussion?
I'm going to support that motion. It won't be necessary then to vote on Amendment 1A, since that's only needed if we don't approve Amendments 1 and 2. There's lots of instances, I think, where there's residential located in RO zone. It is residential office, obviously. So there are situations where there's residential in there, and that's particularly true in Chugach Eagle River, in downtown Eagle River, in the CERO zone district. That's an overlay district in downtown. That is almost all residential. So what you're allowing is marijuana sales establishments in a residential zone. I mean, it can happen and probably will happen. And I think it's clear the rest of the ordinance says, no, we don't think that's a good idea. There's no other parts of the ordinance which allow marijuana sales in residential. So to be consistent, we should approve those amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. Any additional comment? Mr. Spinelli.
So I kind of feel like marijuana retail sales happen in residential districts all day, every day, probably for the history of time. And I feel like since all these are going to take a conditional use permit of the assembly, I'm going to probably vote for, I guess, the least strictest rules, or allowing the most, so I will vote against that.
Thank you, Mr. Spinelli. Mr. Walker.
Just a quick question for staff. Are alcohol sales allowed in the RO district or the CERO?
Through the chair, Mr. Walker, you cannot have a liquor store, but you can have a restaurant in the new code.
Okay, thank you. Just for that reason alone, just on equity, I'll probably be supporting this motion. I think for the most part, it makes sense to try to make this as consistent. And I agree with Andre. I'd hate to see us go overboard in being restrictive, but there's nothing that says we should make this less restrictive than alcohol, which is already working. So,
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Seeing no others in the queue, please vote on this amendment. That amendment passes. Am I counting right? 5. We need 5 yeas. So if, just as an aside, a 4 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A 4 to 2 vote does not constitute approval. So that amendment does pass. Mr. Spring, do you have another motion?
Yes, amendment number 3 on your attachment 1, minimum distance for certain uses. Add the phrase existence of marijuana or to the existing paragraph, subsection B3.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. Is there a second? Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Any discussion?
I'd like to speak to that, and it's just a I think this is more of administrative, more of a clerical issue here, just to be consistent. Otherwise, if we don't include that, then it will prohibit the marijuana sales, I think, and it will put it in the same category as adult bookstores and strip clubs, basically, and you have to be separate 1,000 feet from those. So.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. Good catch. Please vote. Mr. Spring, you actually need, there you go. That amendment number 3 passes. Mr. Spring.
Okay, yes, amendment number 4 on attachment 1. I'll read the change in the wording to add, for the purpose of this section, substantially different means any material change in the operation of the business which could result in significant impact on the use and enjoyment of adjacent properties by property owners or occupants. Yeah.
Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Kange. Mr. Spring?
Yes, I think that's another clerical change. In this consistency issue, substantially different is discussed in other sections of the code regarding liquor stores, right? I believe, staff. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the same as liquor store regulations, but it does seem to make sense to be somewhat consistent. And without this definition, it's really going to be pretty arbitrary how you interpret that.
Thank you. Please vote on amendment number 4. That amendment passes. Mr. Spring.
Yes, amendment number 5 would change, would state that for marijuana testing facilities and marijuana retail sales establishment in the CEDO district, change T to T-B. This would be consistent with the previous amendment that we made, amendment number 1, which included delete the T for marijuana retail sales establishment in the CERO district. This would limit the marijuana sales in that overlay district just to the B3 zoning district and not allowed in the RO, which we previously denied.
Seconded by Ms. Bailey. Thank you. Comment or question by Mr. Walker? Are you good?
Oh, just that it says, I think it says DO. I just want to make sure we memorialize the correction into the record here. Instead, make it say RO instead of DO.
Yeah, I believe it is DO. Is that right? It's the downtown overlay, or is it RO?
It's DO.
DO.
It's the downtown overlay.
But it seems like it's clerical in consistency with what we've passed previously. So
Yes, that's right, Mr. Chair.
please vote on amendment number 5. That amendment is approved.
Amendment number 6, well, actually, I'm getting confused about numbering, but it says number 6 on the...
Yeah, just to be
sheet.
clear, and I said that to Lori, the numbers we're going to go on are the numbers in our chart
That's
rather
good.
than what were the number of our motions.
Although, yeah, we only have 5 amendments. Okay, this involves notice of community meeting. It adds wording stating the following. If the applicant does not use the community council meeting as the community meeting, the applicant shall provide community council notice in accordance with subsections H6 below.
Thank you. That's seconded by Ms. Bailey. Any discussion? Please vote. That is approved.
I'd just like to make a finding on that one just real briefly, and this regards the comment by the Fairview Community Council, just to make sure that there's some kind of contact with the Community Council and is not overlooked.
Agreed. Thank you.
Amendment number 7. This adds marijuana cultivation facility to the R6, R7, R8, R9, R10 districts with the following. Only cultivation facilities with limited marijuana cultivation facility license from the state of Alaska are permitted in the residential district indicated in tables 21.05-1 and 21.10-4.
Is there a second? Ms. Bailey, thank you. Mr. Walker.
Quick question for staff on the 500-foot maximum, 500 square foot maximum. Does that maximum apply to all of these R6 through R10 zoning districts with regard to on-site horticulture in these districts? Or?
Do you mean, do other types of horticulture have a 500 square foot maximum?
Yes.
So if you were going to grow corn,
Right.
that's your question?
Yes.
No.
Okay, so I don't think we discussed a 500-foot maximum at the last meeting. Was that something suggested by staff? Or?
Well, there was testimony from the public regarding the limited cultivation facility license, which has the 500 square foot max, and how it was some people's opinion that the intent of that type of license was to allow people who are currently growing in their homes to continue. So I kind of made the assumption that that was what the commission had intended to propose as an amendment, but I'm not 100% sure. So if that was not your intent,
Okay.
Please amend it.
Thank you. I guess the only thing I would have to say to that would be, in my mind, it seems like the intent here is to allow someone who's in one of these large lot districts, you've got 5 acres, you want to grow a half acre of marijuana, go with God. I mean, so are we gonna cut them off? 500 square feet seems like a limitation for an improved property rather than an unimproved property. And I would think that the density, I don't really know anything about growing this stuff, but from the photos, it looks like the density is much higher when you grow it inside because you're stacking it versus outside where you got to spread it out and you can only do it on one level. So I don't know if we want to make sure that we consider that when we're looking at this amendment.
I'll listen to Ms. Bailey and then Mr. Spring on this.
I wasn't going to directly comment on that, so if someone wanted to go back and make an amendment, but just going to the motion that was presented, I know that the staff does not recommend supporting this amendment, but I think it's important to note that they're not automatically allowed in these areas. They still have to go through that application process, so I think kind of going off what Commissioner Spinelli said earlier, of being as open as possible and allowing the application process to work is a better idea than just outright not allowing it into an area. So I would be interested in hearing more conversation on the limited cultivation, but as far as the base motion, I will be supporting that.
Ms. McConnell, did you have a comment?
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to follow up on Mr. Walker's comments. At this time, outdoor cultivation is not permitted. So if you were desirous of allowing outdoor cultivation, you would need to change lines 45 through 50 on page 12 of the ordinance. The state regulations particularly say that cultivation has to be indoors unless allowed to be outdoors by the local government.
Do we know, is that a security thing, or they don't want kids coming over?
I think it's related to both those issues.
Okay. All right.
Can I hear from Mr. Spring? Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So what are the security requirements for currently that they'd have to meet in these districts?
In these districts?
Yes. Or anywhere where cultivation's allowed?
So if you can give me a second, I can look up to see what the state requirements are. The municipal requirements relating to security are going to be in the licensing ordinance, and there's not a final draft of those yet.
Is that all, Mr. Spring?
Yes, thank you.
While Eric is looking that up, I'm just going to say, I think this amendment, and I appreciate staff's effort to sort of capture it, but I think we're confusing two things. One is what came up in testimony was the idea that in these larger lots to actually allow sort of an outdoor application. Number two, what we heard in testimony is for the limited marijuana cultivation and limited to 500 square feet, you're really talking about an area that's similar to a garage, right? So in a residential. So and I'm not saying I support either of those at this point in time, but I just want to make sure that we understand what I think we're sort of mixing the two efforts. I agree 500 feet doesn't, if you're going to allow 500 feet on a large lot, why not allow it on a small lot is my sort of impression, but anyhow, just my recollection from before, and I personally don't agree with staff's recommendation and not support it at this time. But Ms. McConnell, any other clarification?
Sure. Just reading from Article 7 of the state regulations, which are operating requirements for all marijuana establishments. Section 710, restricted access areas, states a marijuana establishment shall restrict access to any part of the licensed premises where marijuana or a marijuana product is grown, processed, tested, stored, or locked. Except as provided in the section about retail stores, each entrance to a restricted access area must be marked by a sign that says restricted access area. Visitors must be escorted. Security alarm systems and lock standards. The licensed premises of a marijuana establishment must have exterior lighting to facilitate surveillance, a security alarm system on all exterior doors and windows, continuous video monitoring. So these are some of the requirements from the state regulations.
For the limited marijuana cultivation facility specifically?
For all marijuana
For all.
establishments.
Thank you. Mr. Spinelli.
Yeah, I have a question on the restricted access. I mean, let's just say that we did approve this amendment, and I guess where I had envisioned it was less, say, in a R6 or R7 or any zoning like a neighborhood, but maybe in larger undeveloped parcels. Say you had 100 acres. I mean, there's several 100-acre sites on the hillside that are kind of been deemed undevelopable for residential. They're just, the cost of the infrastructures outweigh the profitability, I guess, of the development. If you had a marijuana facility in the middle of undeveloped area that's surrounded by woods and creeks and topography, would that be considered restricted, or would you have to put up some kind of barbed wire fence, or do you define how that property would be restricted?
Through the chair, Mr. Spinelli, I was quoting from the state regulations, and so I don't feel like I can speak to how they would interpret that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Spring.
Is horticulture allowed in each of these districts, R6, R7, R8, R9, R10?
Commercial horticulture is a conditional use in the R1 R1, R1A, R2A, R2D, R2M, R5, R6, R7, R8, and R9. Conditional use in all those districts.
Just a comment on my vote. I think I'm going to vote in favor of this one. There's obviously, based on my reading, a lack of industrial space, a lack of warehousing space, and it seems to me that there's a ample supply of large lot, single family. There's just more than we can use in the next 40 years, probably. It seems like a good use of the land instead of something more valuable like industrial, Ship Creek land, where you need it for warehousing. I think it's going to be a real crunch in trying to find space here, unless we're satisfied with maybe it happening in the valley, which we all know is already happening. But if we want to allow it, we're going to allow people to smoke it, we should allow people to grow it here, and I think this will open it up. I'm convinced that the security arrangements will be adequate. The same security is going to be applied to any other cultivation facility. So maybe because of the remoteness, people are thinking, that even though you have the security, there'll be people that'll be attempted to break in. But I think it might be a useful amendment to consider.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. Any additional comments? Please vote. That amendment fails 4-2.
Amendment number 9.
I believe 8.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss one? Sorry. Oh, yes, sorry. Number 8, allow retail stores in the R1 district.
Is there a second? Mr. Walker seconded. Mr. Spring?
I think I'm more in favor of this change than I was when we discussed it last week, given that the new information regarding the federal requirements for setbacks from other facilities like playgrounds and schools and 1,000 feet. It seems like that's pinching the retail sales opportunities a little bit too tight. I think R1, I understand the concern with preserving R1 land for industrial, but the fact is the horse is already out of the gate there. And it's going to continue to be developed as retail, the R1, I think. It's not going to change so suddenly into not becoming retail. And I think this is appropriate use. In fact, these might be better sites for marijuana retail. They're probably further removed from residential, probably further removed from churches and et cetera. So maybe they'll be less visible or offensive to neighborhoods as a result.
Thank you.
Did I do motion? Okay.
I think we already have a second. Did we have a second? We did. Okay, there we are. Please vote on allowing retail stores in the I-1 district. That amendment passes. Amendment number 9.
Number 9. Let's see, I'll make a motion here first. Thank you. Allow retail stores in the I-2 district with the footnote reference the standard below. A marijuana retail sales establishment is permitted in the I-2 district when co-located with and attached to a marijuana cultivation facility or a marijuana manufacturing facility.
Is that still, that was your motion, and Mr. Walker, you seconded that, or is that from previous? Are you okay with a second on that one, too?
Yeah, that was from before, but I'll go with that. It's fine.
Thank you. Mr. Spring?
I think staff has a good point about the separation. Didn't occur to me that that would be a problem necessarily. My assumption was that if they're co-located, they'd be basically in the same building with a wall separating them. This could be abused somewhat, I guess, if you wanted to. establish a marijuana sales in an industrial zone and maybe have a small cultivation, and a large retail. I don't know how to address that, however, in the amendment.
So your point being, as currently written, what we're saying it has to be in the same building. You're not sure that you necessarily agree with that, but we don't have an easy fix to it here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I misinterpret staff's comment then? I thought that's what you said. They can be
As written, the answer is no for them being allowed. Correct, Ms. McConnell?
Correct. I think you're saying the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I withdraw that comment. Sorry.
Mr. Walker, do you have a comment? No. Any other comment on amendment number 9, allowing retail stores in the I-2 district with the language provided in the amendment? Please vote. That amendment passes.
Amendment number 10, separation from protected land uses. All marijuana establishments shall be located at least 500 feet from the following uses: deleted, homeless and transient shelters, dedicated parks, habilitative care facilities. The second part, B, add the wording to the edge of a playground or athletic field, including abutting parking lots.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. Is there a second? Ms. Bailey, thank you. Any additional comments? I would simply comment that I believe our action there is to take off the only thing that we're able to take off in terms of limiting the separation distances. Please vote. That amendment passes.
Amendment number 11, add the concentration of marijuana facilities within a 1,000-foot radius of the proposed facility is appropriate.
Is there a second? Failing a second, that motion dies.
I would like to address that, though, if I could.
I need a second for you to speak to it. Anybody wishing to second? Oh, you got one. Spinelli. Go ahead,
Okay,
Mr.
well, I
Spring.
know when I'm going to lose this one, but my concern was that there was a requirement to put some information in the license application about 1,000 foot, but no direction on how that was going to be treated by the assembly and reviewing it. So it would be good to have, and I assume that the reason for including that in the application was that in some cases there might be a problem with concentrating marijuana sales in a small area. And I think that's going to happen. I'm not a commercial realtor, but I suspect a lot of these places are going to go look for cheap rents, and there's going to be a finding that there's certain areas that are probably cheaper than others, and they're going to be congregating in those areas because it's a profit business, right? So they're probably won't go downtown, rent's too high. Spenard Road comes up as I could think that might be a good place with cheaper rents there. In Muldoon Road might be a good place. I got a feeling that you're going to see a real concentration of these sales outlets in certain areas, and there's no restrictions on them. And I might say also that I did do some research on some of the ordinances in Washington State, and not all the cities enacted regulations, some just deferred action later, but there's at least 2 of them, Bellevue and Vancouver, which impose a separation distance between the facility, between the retail. I think one has a 1,000-foot separation and one has a 300-foot separation. I don't think I want to go that far. I don't think I want to say, although I'd be willing to consider that, an actual imposing of a separation distance. But I think at a minimum, it needs to be clear that the assembly can deny an application if they see that there's a concentration. Right now, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that they can deny it based on that. That's not one of the criteria. How do they say I'm sorry, you can't have marijuana sales here. Too many in this block, say there's 4 within a 2-block radius. It's information they have, but there's not part of the criteria. So they can't deny it, can they? I mean, doesn't seem like it's possible with that kind of loose, interpretation of the law.
You have a number of comments following your testimony here. Mr. Kange.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with you, Mr. Spring, but I think I kind of want to let the markets decide what's going to go where. And for example, I was just down in California recently last week when I left here, and I was doing some market research, and they're literally 2-3 doors down from each other, and I think the markets will, if you have a poor establishment or whatever the case is, your business is next to another establishment. Well, I mean, I think the markets will tend to drive that. I mean, I think it's a good idea, but I think in this case, when we put so many limitations on where we can go in the B3 areas, I think 1,000 feet, we might, who knows? So.
Thank you, Mr. Spinelli.
I was asking just to clarify it because I didn't quite understand if you were saying they have to be 1,000 feet apart from each other, or they can be.
I think, and if I can just take this, and I think that was staff's concern. Right now, what it basically says is concentrations of marijuana facilities within a 1,000-foot radius can be considered so it is vague, and it doesn't put a number or an exact distance. It just, as Mr. Spring stated, I think that it's something to contemplate, and that maybe you'll know when something becomes overly concentrated. Is that okay to say? Mr. Walker.
I'm sorry to keep going back to the same well here, but is there any kind of concentration rules for alcohol sales, specifically packaged liquor? I mean, I'm using that as an analog for what we're working on here today. So.
No, they have the same kind of notification to the assembly that we're required to let them know about all of their licenses within a 1,000-foot radius.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Seeing no one else in the queue, please vote on amendment number 11. That amendment fails. But nice try, Mr. Spring. Number 12. John, can you put your mic on?
A list of pesticides, herbicides, and or fungicides that may be used in the facility. And just to preface this motion, I'm not going to support it, but I have something I'd like to propose as an alternative.
Would you like to propose that as alternative 12, amendment 12, or you want to just put this one out there?
I'd like to talk about that at the later time, after the amendments. It won't be. It's not an amendment.
You want to give us a hint so we know where you're headed?
Oh yes, I don't think it's appropriate to put to deal with pesticides in this particular ordinance, but I believe it is a real problem with respect to public health. And I'd like to give notice to the Assembly that there is a problem that they should be addressing. And I'd like to do that through a resolution. And I have some information that
Okay, so perhaps you bring that up at the end once we're done with the other. Okay, very good. If there is no second, that amendment dies, and which would be fine, probably. That one goes away. Amendment number 13.
Number 13, allow manufacturing facilities in the B3 district with a footnote reference the standard below. Marijuana manufacturing facilities that only manufacture edibles but do not have extraction facilities or other types of manufacturing are permitted in the B3 district.
Is there a second? Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Mr. Spring, would you like to speak to that amendment?
Yeah, I think we were trying to deal with the distinction between bakeries and manufacturing of the cultivated plants. I think it seemed to me, at least, that renting a bakery or utilizing an existing bakery would be not a noxious use. It would be just like it could fit into a B3 district, whereas now it's only allowed in the I1 districts. But reading the staff support, the staff recommendation, I think it's just getting a little bit too difficult to try to fit this amendment, to deal with this amendment. And I guess we better just consider it as a food processing facility as it currently is addressed. So I won't be supporting the recommendation, the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. Ms. Bailey.
I think the main concern here is that it's, at least that was my gathering from the staff, is that not wanting these areas to be open to the public. But if the business is able to control that on its own, then there wouldn't be a conflict. And so I'll also be voting in favor based on the earlier comments that Mr. Spring suggested, and then based on the idea that all these are going to go through an application process. If the business is going to be responsible, they will be the ones on the line for keeping the public out of those areas in which edibles will be used.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Mr. Walker.
I think some consideration should be given to the smell that, and I guess I'm not quite sure what we mean when we talk about if you're baking with something that's already been extracted, that might be one thing, but I could imagine certain types of cooking that could create a pretty significant odor. So I don't know if we want to consider that here or not, or if we're figuring that it's already been extracted and they're only baking it into something.
So to paraphrase Mr. Walker, you're sort of conditionally supporting this, but not supporting as written?
Yes.
Okay, any other comment? Mr. Spinelli.
To address Mr. Walker's comment, maybe we can ask staff, doesn't the code already limit noxious gases or smells or odors?
Through the chair, Mr. Spinelli, there are restrictions on operating requirements, operating standards that create dangerous, injurious, noxious, or otherwise objectionable conditions that would create adverse impacts on the residents, employees, or visitors on the property itself or on nearby properties.
So one more follow-up, please. Would it be your opinion that we keep coming back to the smell of marijuana, but I'm kind of thinking that the code already addresses this? If something stinks, people complain about it, and the code allows for the problem to be remedied. Is that correct?
Through the chair, Mr. Spinelli, I believe I handed out last meeting the handout from the Department of Health about how they address odor complaints. It is a difficult issue to address because there is no real measurable way to tell whether there's a problem, how bad the problem is, that sort of thing.
So that's through the state, but how about through our conditional use permit? These are all conditional use permits issued by the Assembly, correct?
Sorry, I was speaking of our Municipal Department of Health and Human Services.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess then wouldn't the conditional use permit be able to, restrict itself based on odor complaints to the neighbors, or no? I guess that might be getting too in the weeds.
I mean, the standard on page 12 of the ordinance is that the premise shall be ventilated so that the odor of marijuana cannot be detected by a person with a normal sense of smell at any lot line of the subject property.
Oh, it sounds like it's kind of taking care of itself.
But, the conditional use or the special land use happens before the use is actually established, so you don't really know what the odor is going to be at the time you're evaluating the application.
Is it relevant that it come up at renewal?
The license gets renewed, not the land use approval. but I would imagine if there's a big problem, it will come up.
What happens if the license goes away? They still maintain the land use
Nope,
approval?
land use approval goes away as well.
Okay. Ms. Bailey?
Just to kind of clarify why I'm going to be supporting this is the original reason this was brought up at the last meeting was to kind of create consistency between a bakery and other companies that are making edibles. It didn't seem to be that there was any main distinction between those two, and so to kind of categorically allow and promote one business while not doing it for another didn't seem to make sense, at least to me. In addition, I think it also mentions that it's specifically one that does not have extraction facilities, and based on the comments that we've received and other research I've done, that is the process that's more engaged, where it has the odor, that the cultivation and the extraction, not so much as the actual manufacturing of the edibles.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Any additional comments? Please vote. That amendment passes. Number 14, I know it has my name attached to it, but I would appreciate someone putting it out there. Thank you, Mr. Spring.
Amendment number 14, allow cultivation facilities in B3 district.
Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Spinelli. Anyone wishing to speak? Mr. Walker?
Hadn't we discussed earlier maybe beefing this up to say that if they were co-located with retail? Is that your intent here or no?
I think a previous amendment would allow retail stores to be co-located in the I-1 district currently, as we approved it.
Right. So my question is, when we went through these earlier in this session, and we discussed basically making this amendment contingent on it being co-located with retail. Am I completely confused here?
Oh, yeah, no.
I think, Mr. Walker, I think in the context of staff's comment to not support it, it was brought up as perhaps by Ms. Bailey. Maybe that's what she wants to speak to, that as a way to open up the use in a more civic-friendly manner. But I'll let her speak to that.
I would support it with that language. I'll say that.
Yeah, I'm not getting the option to move to amend this motion, but that was something that I brought up, and so I would like to move to amend this to say allow, and you have to apologize that I have a bit of a cold and I've stumbled over it earlier, but to allow cultivation facilities in the B3 district if they are co-located with and attached to a marijuana retail establishment.
I'd second that.
Thank. So what we have is a motion to amend amendment number 14. Thank you, Ms. Bailey, and that's seconded by Mr. Kange. Any additional comment?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
My only additional comment is that I think it just addresses the concerns that staff has and that it maintains the business neighborhood while also allowing something to take place where there's not a lot of space for it right now.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Anything else, Mr. Kange?
I'd just like to add that I'll support my motion, and I'd just like to point out we can do findings now or later, but I'd just like to point out this was supported by public testimony that we heard last week.
So please vote on the amendment to Amendment 14. Am I missing? That passes. So you have before you the back Amendment 14. Ms. Bailey, can I have you read that one more time as amended?
Allow cultivation facilities in the B3 district that are co-located with and attached to a marijuana retail establishment.
Any additional comment on Amendment 14? Please vote. That amendment passes. Amendment number 15. Mr. Spring.
Neighborhood responsibility plan, the neighborhood, adding the following, the neighborhood responsibility plan shall at a minimum address the following. A, establishing a point of contact, those name and contact information should be clearly posted on the outside of the store. A schedule of outreach to the surrounding area, residents and property owners within 500 feet, and or the community council to be not less than one contact per year. C, discussion of how problems, issues, disputes brought forward by neighbors will be addressed, such as meeting with the complainant or discussing the issue at a community council meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. Is there a second? Mr. Spinelli, thank you. Any discussion? Mr. Kange.
Again, while the intent of this may appear good, I just believe that we don't make any, we don't make any other business do this, and maybe I could get on board if it was something similar. If there were so many complaints in the code, then you have to come up with this plan. But to hinder a legal business at this point with this type of plan, I just can't support this time with the amendments.
Mr. Spinelli.
Just to clarify, this requirement is already in the code, and this motion just clarifies what the requirement actually is. So if I hear you right, I would think that we would vote this down, and then you would make another motion to just remove the neighborhood responsibility plan altogether? I'd support that.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Spinelli. Mr. Spring, do you have anything additional?
I was going to make the same comment.
So the motion on the table is for staff's clarification, which gets back to sort of the nebulous neighborhood responsibility plan that either goes or no goes. Is that everybody's understanding? Okay. I'm going to make a comment. This neighborhood responsibility plan does not take away, or denial or removal of it doesn't take away the issue of notice to the community councils. It's simply a plan that I think at this point is not that well defined, and I'm not going to support it at this point. I think we heard testimony previously where it's been utilized for other uses in the community, and I would be all for a process that adds all kinds of uses that are causing problems in the neighborhood, but with more concrete roles and responsibilities, not just between a private business owner and a community, but that also involves tri-party with the municipality as well. I think some of those protections are already in place. Mr. Spring?
Yeah, I'd just like to also add to that, I think as I understand, the licenses are renewed every year, so there's opportunity to address these issues through the assembly.
With or without a formal responsibility plan?
Even without a neighborhood responsibility plan.
Please vote on amendment number 15. That amendment fails. Shall we go for a fifth?
Could I make a comment? I thought the amendment was to eliminate the responsibility plan altogether. Was that, or there's two amendments? Which one are we voting on?
The amendment that we voted on was the staff recommendation, and I think it's appropriate to take up the full responsibility plan if that's the desire of the commission, or to simply allow it as originally written. Mr. Kange, do you have a motion?
Yes.
Maybe we can call this 15A.
Right. That's the plan. In regard to case 2015-0119, I move to remove the neighborhood responsibility plan from the ordinance.
That is seconded by Ms. Bailey. Any discussion?
I'd just like to state for the record that I will support this motion. Again, I think we've talked about this neighborhood responsibility plan being somewhat vague, and at this point I cannot support the task of putting this on prospective business owner.
Thank you, Mr. Kange. Any additional discussion? Hearing none, please vote on what we're calling Amendment 15A. That amendment passes. Moving on to, at least in how I'm following, Attachment 2, Amendment 16. Thank you, Mr. Spring.
Yes, remove marijuana sales establishments from the B1A, B1B zoning districts.
I want to get a second. Thank you, Mr. Walker. Mr. Spring, do you wish to speak to the motion?
Yes, I maybe I have a conflict here, but I live in an area where there's a B1B, and there aren't that many B1B or B1A districts around, but they're almost inevitably in the middle of a neighborhood, and I think it's a great zoning district. I wish there were more of them. I'm not sure, though, that it's a good idea to, if we're not allowing them in residential districts, to permit them in neighborhood business district, which is almost inevitably in the middle of a residential district. So that's why I won't be voting for it, or that's why I'll be voting for this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Spring. I, too, will be voting to support Amendment number 16. Please vote. That amendment passes. Number 17, Mr. Spring.
Number 17 changes to the separation from protected land uses, adding 2A, all marijuana establishments shall be located at least 1,000 feet away from the following uses: boarding school, college or university, elementary or middle school, high school, playground, housing facility owned by a public housing authority. B, adding all marijuana establishments shall be located at least 500 feet away from the following uses: community centers, neighborhood recreation centers, religious assemblies, correctional institutions, athletic fields, correctional community residential centers. C, all marijuana establishments shall be located at least 100 feet away from video arcades with at least 10 arcade machines. D, adding the phrase "to the edge of a playground or athletic field including abutting parking lots," and deleting, well, the deletions are shown in the amendment.
Thank you. That Amendment 17 is seconded by Mr. Kange. Mr. Spring.
Well, this is obviously just is intended to comply with federal requirements for drug-free zones. According to staff, it appears that there really is no choice but to approve it. There's the Cole memorandum. Attorney General Cole has expressed the fact that they won't interfere with local marijuana laws as long as it doesn't conflict with federal laws or fail to protect children. And I think, it's just prudent to avoid the controversy or the problems in the future by addressing this. I do have that issue, though, about what happens if a school moves into the radius of marijuana sales. And that seems like that would not comply with the intent of the federal requirements. I don't think they make an exception at all regarding whether or not it's there before or after. So I think that's a problem, and I would like, as I previously suggested, that maybe the attorney look at that and see if that is a problem.
Yeah, that's well stated. I think that I think we have less concern about new schools popping up given our population projections, but perhaps those pesky arcades might prove problematic. I think we've made a recommendation, and hopefully that can be passed along as a finding that the municipality contemplate what happens in that case. Is there any other comment on amendment number 17? Any discussion? Please vote. passes. Amendment 18.
Mr. Chair, before you move on to Amendment 18, could I just note that the passage of Amendment 17 basically invalidates the passage of Amendment 10? Just
Thank you, Ms. McConnell. We're going to miss you. So, was not Amendment 10 striking certain uses that are still shown as stricken in this amendment?
yes, but this amendment reorganizes some of the uses that are not stricken into the 1,000-foot, the 500-foot, and the 100-foot. So it basically supersedes Amendment 10.
But it's sort of, this amendment honors the things that were deleted in Amendment 10. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm fine with that. Everybody good with that? Thank you. Amendment 18.
Amendment 18, edit AMC 2105-055A2D as follows. This distance shall be measured from the lot line of the proposed marijuana establishment to the edge of a playground or athletic field, including abutting parking lots, or to the closest lot line of any other use listed above. And those, I think those uses are in 17, correct?
Correct.
That's got a second from Mr. Kange. Mr. Spinelli.
I don't support the motion. I do feel that it would simplify a lot of things to measure from the lot line. I just can't support further restricting something that we've already overly restricted, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Spinelli. Ms. Bailey.
I agree with Mr. Spinelli. I will not be supporting this amendment, especially because we're dealing with industrial areas, which are going to be these large complexes in and of themselves. So if they're connected to another area in that, it's just going to further restrict them for no reason other than to make it easier for us to administrate it. So if they're following the application process, they're going to have to show how they're complying anyways.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Any additional discussion? Please vote on Amendment 18. That amendment fails. Amendment 19.
Number 19, amendment number 19, relating to AMC 2105-055A5, inspection of premises. I'll read the new version. All premises of all marijuana establishments shall be open for the inspection and examination by the municipality at any reasonable time and in a reasonable manner.
Is there a second? Last chance for a second. Seeing none, Amendment 19 dies. Mr. Spring, I believe you had an additional amendment.
Yes, it's not an amendment per se. It's a recommendation to forward a resolution to the Assembly in conjunction with this recommendation, the ordinance recommendation. And this pertains to pesticides use on cannabis cultivation. I decided after I proposed the previous amendment that it's more appropriate for this to be addressed through the state of Alaska. But as from background for the commission, currently there is no approved pesticides for cultivation of cannabis. It's not allowed because it's illegal under federal law to grow cannabis, and therefore the federal insecticide, fungicide, and rodenticide Act doesn't cover it. So states are all over the place, medical marijuana states as well as recreational states are kind of scrambling to try to deal with this. And they are having some problems with it. And The problem I see is that there's no control over pesticides, and it will be used in the growing of marijuana plants. There are insects, mites, for instance, and fungus that grows on these plants, especially when it's indoor. And it's inevitable, and it's been shown in the past that in other states that they do use pesticides. Now, moreover, not all pesticides are going to be harmful to people, but they have done studies in Oregon, at least one study in Oregon, rather, relating to testing of the products. And there's, of course, the flowers that are used for smoking, and then there's the concentrates through the manufacturing process. And the testing revealed some concentrations of pesticides, residual pesticides, in these that were registered pesticides that are potentially harmful to humans. And I'll give you some of the results of the study real quick.
But
It won't take any
do you have I need a motion.
Oh, you do?
You're speaking to a motion that doesn't exist yet. I let you go on because you're on a roll, but could I get a main motion?
Okay. Well, it involves lengthy resolutions and
course.
whereases and whatever that could be clarified through this discussion, but
Okay.
I could do it.
Why don't you go ahead and do it, and then
Wrap it up?
go ahead and if you can just wrap up, but then we want to hear your motion.
I'm almost done, yeah. So, the study showed that 29% of the flower buds or whatever had a detectable level of pesticides. 55% of the concentrates did. And moreover, 14% of the flowers had failed the EPA standard for pesticides in crops that are used by humans. 46% failed under the concentrates. So there's a real problem. My resolution is going to be a recommendation for a resolution is to urge, and here I'll give the recommendation here, under the motion, if I may. Urge the State of Alaska Marijuana Control Board to provide clear information about acceptable pesticide usage to cannabis growers. Growers should be informed that the only acceptable pesticides are those that are listed as minimum risk in the FIFRA 25B, exempt from EPA tolerances and accepted for use in organic practice. Now, this is a recommendation that was delivered by the Cannabis Safety Institute, and it was based on that study I told you about and their review of pesticides used throughout the United States. This is basically telling the Marijuana Control Board,
You now have a second. How about that?
Get your act together and do something about it. And they're just sitting on their, seats and refusing to recognize the problem. My problem with approving this ordinance is that we're leaving a big gaping hole and potentially jeopardizing the citizens of Anchorage's health.
Thank you, Mr. Spring, and you have a second by Mr. Kange, and I think if you could provide the written form to Lori, but anyone needing it repeated, I do have a couple people in the queue. Andre?
My original reason I jumped in the queue was as a point of order. Did we vote on the original? We voted on all the amendments, but I don't think we voted on the original motion.
Right, and this is I'm considering an amendment number 20,
Okay.
which is to accompany the ordinance and amendments with this additional resolution. It doesn't.
Okay.
My understanding is it doesn't do anything
Okay.
codified. But
And
thank
then
you.
just to speak to that then I guess as far as I don't want to over-regulate the marijuana industry, but I don't want to poison people, so I'll support it.
How kind of you. Ms. Bailey.
I think the resolution or the motion as proposed is an honorable one. However, I just personally don't feel comfortable doing a blanket overhaul of what can be allowed and what cannot be allowed when I do not have any of the evidence or any of the studies in front of me. I think I really admire the research you went into it, and if we wanted to take that up at another date, I think that'd be great. But I have the same concerns with this as doing like a blanket no GMO proposal when there's things such as yellow rice, which is curing vitamin D deficiency for pretty much all of China. And so doing a blanket no pesticides except for this allowed, or no GMO except for this, I think it's us kind of getting out of, at least I'm 100% out of my expertise here. So I think it's an honorable motion, but I will definitely be voting no just because I have no information in front of me, and nor have I had the time to really research this to know if this is a good one.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Mr. Walker.
Well, I couldn't agree more that we're all outside of our expertise here, but in the vein of not wanting to poison people, I will be supporting the resolution to recommend this. And who knows, maybe we caused something that got overlooked to get more scrutiny. So,
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Any additional discussion? Please vote. Convinced Andre at the end. That motion passes. Are there any additional amendments to the main motion? Hearing none, I believe the main motion as amended is in front of us. We're scrolling up 20 lines. Hold on a second. John, was this your? Did you make the main motion? Yes. With a second by Ms. Bailey. So the what is in front of us is a recommendation to the Anchorage Assembly to adopt an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code, new code, Title 21, to enable marijuana establishments, and amending Anchorage Municipal Code, old code, to enable retail marijuana stores in the downtown central business district. And this is a recommendation and a motion that has been amended, that we've all patiently gone through. Appreciate that. It's before us. Any additional comment or discussion from the commission? Please vote. The motion carries. Are there any additional findings?
Yes.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, it was not allowing us on this. I'd just like to commend staff in the Municipal Assembly and members of the commission that worked on the ordinance. And I think they did a good job. It was a tough one, really hard. I wouldn't be surprised, however, that it's amended in the future as we go through this process and figure things out. I mean, that seems like that's, everybody's going to have to do that, in every state that enacts it. But I think they did. I think we addressed the major issues, and I hope the Assembly takes our recommendations and considers them thoroughly. I think they were based on what we heard from the public testimony, and I think the public brought some good issues up, and I hope we addressed those in our amendments, and maybe even added a few that weren't considered originally by the public or the staff.
Any additional findings? I would simply add that I think we heard a decent representation in public testimony from the industry. We had a few people come forward from neighborhoods and communities. I frankly would have expected more discussion from the neighborhoods themselves. I know this is an ordinance that has come along quickly here at the end, in part because of a timeline that we're required to follow by the state, and they took their time in terms of getting the regulations to us. I've had at least one email recently from the Midtown Community Council indicating that they've not had a chance to discuss it. And if you look at the areas that likely are available, Midtown is highlighted, and I recommend it to them, and I'd recommend to anybody else that the Assembly hearing will be coming up soon, and that will be another opportunity for people to testify. But I appreciate staff's analysis, and I agree with you. I think this will be somewhat of a design do. I think there will be some changes along the way. Thank you. And that recommendation moves forward to the Assembly. I don't have a calendar in front of me, and I'm not sure when it hits them, but I've been told it's pretty soon. That concludes the cases on our agenda. I did want to take a moment to, if I could, recognize Ms. McConnell. Is this your last meeting with us? Thank you for all of your support. Erica puts up with a lot from a lot of us in a lot of different capacities, and you do a great job. So, thanks. Is there anything else, any other comments from the Commission? I believe Mr. Walker has a motion to adjourn. We are adjourned.